Stirling, 1507, the world's first man-powered flight. I'm James Brown, I'm an independent historical researcher, and I'm going to tell you the tale of an alchemist in Stirling Castle. Scottish castles are famed across the world. Two of the most famous, in fact, are sitting on top of volcanoes. Well, thankfully not active volcanoes. Edinburgh Castle is the most famous. It's the one visited by most people, logically, because it's in the centre of the capital of Scotland. But I think a more interesting and more attractive castle is Stirling. Stirling too is sitting on the top of a redundant volcano. But it's so beautiful because of its surroundings. The landscape is spectacular. The mount, especially in autumn when there's still snow in the mountains, either autumn or winter. And it was set within royal parks as well, hunting parks and so on. But a story I'm going to tell you about Stirling Castle is actually a claim, which I think is a pretty strong claim, for the world's first man-powered flight in the 16th century. How did this come about? Well, it's a man who's had a difficult, awkward press, a man called John Damien. We don't know whether he was Italian or French. At the time, Scotland had a lot of European connections. Since 1707, since it became part of the United Kingdom, in many ways these direct links with continental Europe have been severed. But in the early 1500s, when Scotland's king James IV was on the throne, he was a very important monarch within Europe. He was well liked, he was well known, and my goodness, this man had interests. He was a Renaissance man. That's the best way to describe him. Just as Leonardo da Vinci can be described as a Renaissance man. In fact, it's often said of Leonardo that he was the last man on this planet to have known something about everything. He wasn't just a painter or an engineer or what have you, designed military castles, and won't go into so many of these inventions of Leonardo because we're here to talk about James IV. James IV, a Scots king, was interested in dentistry. He even experimented, or somebody experimented on him in doing tooth extraction and so on. But he was very much interested in medicine and dentistry and language and of course flight, which is the subject of this talk. The language part is a peculiar one, actually. Is planted on an island in the Firth of Forth, the main river estuary opposite Edinburgh, and he placed a lady who couldn't speak. She was dumb. And she was placed on that island with a newborn baby. And it was an experiment to see what language would that baby speak. A most peculiar experiment. I don't know the full story, so I will move off it, because I want to go on to John Damien. Now, the court of King James IV at the time was extremely cultured. It was extremely international. There were many Italian minstrels, and there were many French clerks or Flemish masons and so on. From all over Europe, people were heading there because it was a wealthy court. And at the time, James had gold mines in southern Lanarkshire, amongst other things, in his suite of resources and in his crown and his queen's crown. There is actually gold from Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, from the Lead Hills area. Now, at this court, there were also many almost sort of resident entertainers, poets, singers, instrumentalists. We even had English bagpipers. How do we know this? Have a look at the Lord Treasurer's accounts, which is the King's royal accounts, and you will find payments being made to English bagpipers. I'm guessing they were maybe from Northumbria. Northumbrian pipes have their own strong tradition. We tend to think of the bagpipes as just being Highland, but in fact it's a global phenomenon. The national instrument of Bulgaria is bagpipes. In this group of what were called makers, the Scots word makers or makers, were a group of poets, and as you find in any institution, any organisation, where there are a lot of talented people, jealousies arrive. And in the case of a royal court, everyone's vying for royal favour. Now, foreigners coming in like John Damien will be looked askance at and thought, you're not from around here. How's the king favouring you? Because the king was giving this John Damien a lot of money. A lot of money, because John Damien claimed he could turn gold from base metals. He was an alchemist. Alchemists, of course, were employed in many of the European courts. It was the dream of all monarchs, of course, and probably everyone else in the land, to turn base metal into gold. But that would have brought about some jealousies within the court. This is a court that was so rich in talent and poets, as I say, even dancers, African dancers. They're recorded that there were black women, and on one occasion a black baby was born. I said a black baby as if I know what happened, but there was a baby born to one of the African women. There was no record of who the father was. But nevertheless, this caused a stir. People were as curious to see a black baby as an African who had never seen a white man would be curious. So nothing racist about this. This is just simple curiosity. But it did show the wonderful inclusiveness of, to use a modern term, inclusivity in the court of King James. And the English bagpipers, the Italian minstrels, and so on. But two of the Scottish poets, these makers as they were called, Walter Kennedy was one of them. The other was Gavin Dunbar. The fight between these two is memorialised in a wonderful poem known as The Flighting of Kennedy and Dunbar. Now, I mentioned the word flighting. It's not the flight that I'm about to tell you about with John Damien. Flighting is a Scots word for argument, controversy. And these two poets were at two ends of a spectrum of Scottish culture. Walter Kennedy was a Gaelic speaker. William Dunbar, the other half of this controversial poem, was a Scots speaker. And they used this against each other. It's a wonderful device. It is full of cursing and swearing. It is two poets who tear each other apart, ripping each other apart and calling each other terribly rude names and so on. But it is an exceptional piece of work. But that, by the by, that's part of the background. And William Dunbar had a particular dislike of John Damien. So this John Damien tells the king that I think I could create a device whereby mankind can fly. So where did this come from? And actually he did his test flight. His test flight was from the battlements of Stirling Castle. Now, it was a partially successful flight. Dunbar, who didn't like Damien, said his problem was he used chicken feathers. If he had used eagle feathers, he would have been able to fly. Chickens don't fly. If that was the case, Dunbar would have plunged 300 feet, over 100 metres down, onto bare, jagged rocks. He would have been smashed to pieces. Damien survived. How did he survive? I think he got a broken leg. In the records is recorded with some broken bones. Now, what Damien did was he aimed for a loch, a little lake near Stirling Castle. In fact, that loch is remembered in a modern place name in our housing estate called Raploch. And the area around about Stirling Castle in historic times was a very wet area, very low-lying. It's where the River Forth meanders through the very low carse of Stirling. It's low land and it's very wet. We know, in fact, at the time of Timothy Pont, the mapmaker in the late 16th century, that by the absence of place names in this area, except for two, Raploch and Fallinninch, that it must have been a very wet place at the time of John Damien, so the loch might have been quite large. So where did he get the idea? I mentioned earlier Leonardo da Vinci. There is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, who also experimented with flight, not personally, to our knowledge, whereby a man is at the top of a hill with a steep slope. Down at the bottom of that hill, or some way in the distance, is a body of water, a lake. Now, we know if we study people who go paragliding, that the updraft on hills will give you the lift. Even people who are using flying suits that have extensions almost like the wings of a bat can jump off hillsides or mountains and fly and control the flight. So Damien, I suspect, knew of Leonardo da Vinci's experiments. We also know that many Scots, the Scots were in a deep alliance with France since the time of Joan of Arc. So Damien carries this knowledge to Stirling, or this belief in flight, creates his flying kit, jumps off the battlements, and aims for the Raploch. Doesn't quite make it, but it doesn't land with a thump. It lands with a bump, enough to break some bones, but not enough to kill him. I believe that he glided. He might have done a bit of flapping furiously and it's like, it's not working. Maybe I'll glide. And I believe he was gliding towards the loch. Why do I believe that? Because there's a connection, two connections indeed, with Stirling Castle and Colditz Castle in Germany. There was a famous film made, I think called Tunes of Glory, with Alec Guinness in it, Scottish Regiment or so on, and it was filmed in Stirling Castle. Stirling Castle was also used as a location for Colditz, Second World War Colditz, which was a famous prisoner of war camp, a castle at the top of virtually a mountain, an incredible building which still exists. And it was the officer class who were being imprisoned there. So you had some very high-ranking people from RAF and so on, and very clever people were imprisoned in Colditz, not just British prisoners, there were French. In fact, there's a famous tale at Colditz where the French were digging an escape tunnel, and I think they got within about 50 metres of coming up to escape when the Germans discovered the tunnel. Of course, the Germans would have known in the first 50 metres of that tunnel that the French were digging, and the Germans would just say, let them tire themselves out. It saves us worrying about them. So anyway, to the British. What did the British do at Colditz? They built a glider in an attic in Colditz Castle. They built this magnificent glider from all sorts of junk material, and they were ready to propel it off the top of the castle. And the method they were using was a bathtub full of concrete. How they got all this material together, I don't know. But that bathtub was tethered to the drag thing, whoever was dragging the glider along the rails, which were tabletops, I believe it was trestle tables. and they'd throw the bathtub over the side of the battlements and it'd pull the glider and it would fly down to the flat land, and there was a river, just like Stirling. That was the plan. Now, what happens, as always happens in these prisoner of war situations, the Germans know what's going on, but they play along with it and tire out the escapees, the potential escapees, and they discover this glider just before the flight. But they knew it would work. In recent years, a TV company made a documentary about this, and they built a glider. They didn't take the risk of having a person in it, but they built a glider and they launched it off Stirling Castle. Sure enough, and glided gently down to the flat land beside the river. It would have worked. I think that's what happened with John Damien. Now, one other peculiarity about this flight is that I mentioned Fallon Inch. Inch is a Gaelic word for island. I'm not sure of the Fallon part of the place name, but that tells us, I was saying, that it must have been quite a large wetland there. But also at Fallon Inch in First World War, it was actually a First World War aerodrome. And they were experimenting with flights with the Royal Flying Corps, which was the precursor of the RAF. So strangely, Stirling Castle is at the site of the world's first man-powered flight and some of the earliest powered flight in history. Two strange coincidences, and a strange coincidence to link Colditz with John Damien. A wonderful story. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.